Starting. Hi, Brian. Nice to have you again. Today it's going to be a discussion about Myanmar, what is happening in Myanmar, and maybe why don't you give us the context, historical context, and up to what we call the constitutional coup of the beginning of the year. I think the purpose of this discussion is that is to debunk a little bit. There's a portraying of the military as being the bad guys and Aung San Suu Kyi to be the good guys, democracy and freedom and so on. And there's no one actually trying to debunk this whole thing, just to give a more accurate image of what is actually happening in Myanmar. So could you give us maybe the background, maybe historical, and what is happening right now in Myanmar?
People are trying to depict this, especially the Western media, and of course the opposition leaders themselves are trying to depict this as if the military just suddenly seized power, that there was some sort of democracy happening, that the government that was ousted was democratically elected, and they're not really going into the details of what led up to that, why the military would have done that. We saw the Western media talk about things like, oh, they arrested Aung San Suu Kyi because she was using unauthorized radios or something. And as I think people who are following my work realize, that as you dig into who Aung San Suu Kyi was, who she was surrounded with, the nature of the opposition, or I should say her government once they got into power, and now they're the opposition. Once you start digging into their backgrounds, virtually every single one of them is tied directly to these foreign governments, the United States government through the National Endowment for Democracy or USAID, supposedly private corporate foundations like George Soros's Open Society. But as I've shown, there are documents that admit, UK British government documents that admit the US government was working with Open Society. So they're not independent of each other, they're working together. And so her entire political party and the supposed civil society networks that support her party, this was all a creation of the US and also the British government. And there's also a role that Germany, Australia, and other Western allied governments have been playing. To call that a democratically elected government, a government that is the product of foreign intervention, is completely dishonest, completely inaccurate. It is the product of foreign interference. Democracy is a process of self-determination. Everything about Aung San Suu Kyi's government is literally being decided in foreign capitals. And we're probably going to get into her foreign advisors. She literally had foreigners surrounding her, around her constantly, just determining her policies for her. So there was no element of self-determination here at all. It was basically a modern day colonial administration that they installed into power. This is what the military removed from power.
Yes, remember there was this task force Asia Society meeting in 2009, and you had like very top people from the State Department in 2009, and in the task force there was a Sean Turnell, which is an Australian citizen, and that became actually later a personal advisor of Aung San Suu Kyi. Could you give us a little bit the background of this task force and what was the purpose? Because you see, I went through the paper, and there was a lot about talking, not so much about democracy. It was more about how are we going to liberalize Myanmar. When you talk about liberalizing, is how we can get our hands into Myanmar state-owned assets. How we can, like just get into Myanmar and make it a hostage or maybe a US pawn. So can you give us a little bit more information about this paper, this task force?
So this was put out, I'm looking at it right now, it's actually 2010, put out by Asia Society, but it's called Asia Society, but it's basically all these Western interests talking about what they want to do with Asia.
It's the Ford Foundation, right? It's the Ford Foundation behind it, huh?
Actually, there's many foundations behind it. So on the task force, you had the then chairman and CEO of USAID. You had retired U.S. Army General Wesley Clark. You had George Soros himself. You had Kenneth Roth from Human Rights Watch, which plays a very prominent role in using human rights to advance these self-serving agendas of the West. And of course, you said Sean Turnell, and he was an economist. He's on this task force. He also testified in front of the U.S. government, in front of Congress, and he's involved with Open Society. He's also an advisor to USAID. So he's basically like an intermediary between the U.S. government and Myanmar, because he became Aung San Suu Kyi's advisor. And this wasn't something that was a rumor or people were just accusing Aung San Suu Kyi of this. This is what he himself admits. This is what, when he was introduced in Western forums, they would introduce him as an advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi, an economic advisor. And you're exactly right. It's about market liberalization, which this word liberalization is supposed to sound good, but it just means taking away all barriers, protecting Myanmar's resources and ensuring that they're used for the people in Myanmar, and allowing foreign interests to just come in and extract them, and to dominate the domestic markets and to extract resources and ship them out of the country. That's what that means. That's what liberalize. It's liberating Myanmar's resources from its people, from its sovereignty. And if you listen to Sean Turnell in any talk that he gives, all he talks about is the IMF and the World Bank and how they need to get them in there as part of his plan to restructure Myanmar's economy. So that's what we had. We had Aung San Suu Kyi posing as the head of Myanmar's government, but in fact she had, and Sean Turnell is not the only foreign advisor. I'm going to talk about another one here in just a moment. But he is running Myanmar's economic policies, and he's directly interfaced with the U.S. government. This task force was a task force developing U.S. policy toward Myanmar, and then he's whispering into Aung San Suu Kyi's ear about policy Myanmar should adopt in regards to dealing with foreign interests. So they're working both sides, and it was basically a client regime. Aung San Suu Kyi was just a figurehead. Sean Turnell was the one coming up with the economic policy.
Yes, just you and I, we call this hijacking of democracy. And I think it would be good if you can explain exactly, I mean, why it is not a democracy, why it is actually, it's going against the sovereignty of Myanmar, you know, in terms of so touching the media, the information, civil society, and actually politicians, you know, which are all in the hands of the US. Can you explain why we call, you and I, we call this hijacking of democracy?
So again, the term democracy is supposed to mean self-determination. It's a group of people deciding for themselves how they're going to do things, how they're going to move their country forward, in what direction and how. If you have a foreign country interfering in virtually every aspect of your nation's socio-economic and political landscape, is that really self-determination? If the head of Myanmar's government was beholden to these supposed advisors, I think it's more accurate to call them handlers. There was another one, Joseph Fisher. He used to work at the British embassy in Myanmar, and then he's an advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi. And he's the one organizing her communications with other countries and press conferences and things like this. So again, it's not just Sean Turnell, it's also Joseph Fisher from the British embassy. Could you imagine a Russian diplomat coming out of the embassy in Washington, D.C. and then hanging out in the Oval Office with the US president? How unacceptable that would be, how instantly people would identify that as problematic. But here Aung San Suu Kyi is surrounded by this entourage of foreigners, of Americans, British, Australians, and people are acting as if this is normal. This is normal, and this is democracy, and that this was a democratically elected government, and not just a client regime hiding behind democracy. You said about hijacking. If we look at the National Endowment for Democracy funding, that they claim they're funding democracy, but what they're really doing is going into the country and creating a parallel to everything that's already in that country, parallel media that serves US interests, not the people of Myanmar's interests, legal groups, education, communication, resource management, literally everything a government is supposed to do. The US, through the National Endowment for Democracy, sets up a parallel organization. What they're doing is they're setting it up so that eventually it overwrites the indigenous institutions of any targeted country, including especially Myanmar. It's the NED's penetration of Myanmar's socio-political landscape is very deep, and they have taken over almost everything there. And again, this is why the military intervened.
Could you get back to NED, National Endowment for Democracy? Because a lot of people, they hear this, National Endowment for Democracy, it sounds nice, I mean, it's going to bring something really good, because those people are oppressed, they are under military regime. But what is the background of National Endowment for Democracy?
Okay, this is a very important point to iron out, because when you corner someone that is funded by the NED, they will say it's the National Endowment for Democracy. What are you, against democracy? And you have to ask them why. Well, if it's a nice thing, why are you so careful not to even show people that you're funded by the NED? So that's the first telltale sign that something is wrong. But the NED was created in the 1980s. People claim that it's a private, independent organization. It's not. It was created by the US government. It is funded by the US government, is overseen by Congress and the US State Department. So it is basically the funding arm of the US government of political subversion around the globe. And that is exactly what they do. And if you read articles from the Washington Post or the New York Times, even they admit that a lot of what the NED does is the sort of CIA regime change activities that made such a bad name for the CIA. So what they were doing was kind of rebranding that, spinning it off into the National Endowment for Democracy and pretending that this was democracy promotion around the globe. Again, that is an oxymoron, because democracy is a process of self-determination. So if a foreign nation is involved in your country's democracy, then it's no longer democracy, it's foreign interference. That is what the NED does. Foreign interference and regime change. And if you don't believe that, just look at the board of directors. If you go to the board of directors, you will see people like Elliot Abrams, who is a convicted criminal who required a presidential pardon. He was involved with death squads in Central and South America. And then there's people like Carpenter, who literally took part in the US occupation of Iraq. He was part of the provisional government after the US murdered, imprisoned, or drove out the actual Iraqi government. But before they handpicked a client regime, they had these white guys just walking around Iraq, running the country. And he was one of those people. So the whole board of directors are people who are not just advocates of regime change, but directly involved in regime change, because that's what the NED is. It's regime change hiding behind supposedly, the promotion of democracy and freedom.
Well, that is basically what the CIA was doing in the old days. It's just a bit more sophisticated. And we like to actually use the NED platform because it's one of the platforms which is the most transparent. So you can go inside and you can see all the grants they are allocating to the actors that are willing to help them in regime change. There are also other entities like USAID, and it seems actually that they're getting more sophisticated. It seems like now it's no more only the US. There's also some entities like coming from the Australia, ASPI. There's actually some Germans too, German foundation, even Japanese. Can you give us also more information about this? You know, like it's this internationalization. You know, how they're combining forces, and also those other NGOs, foundation, maybe Soros. Can you give us also some more information about Soros?
Okay, so regarding Myanmar specifically, since we're talking about Myanmar, there's the Burma Campaign UK. This is based in the UK. It's backed by the British government, and their whole focus is regime change and interfering in Myanmar's internal political affairs, and reestablishing British influence within Myanmar, their former colony. And in their documents, they admit that the US government, the British government, and organizations like Open Society and USAID, they're all involved in this. It's a combined effort. They do it hand in hand. They coordinate their activities. They're not doing it separately. They create things like Open Society specifically to further launder the money. So instead of the US government directly funding these opposition groups, they launder it through the NED, and they try to spin it as if it's something good. They use things like Open Society. They use things like World Vision. World Vision is supposedly some Christian charity organization. They constantly receive grants from the US State Department. That is another way they launder the money into Myanmar specifically. And then they say it's for this program or that, but you don't know that it's going to any of those programs with World Vision, especially. So what are they doing? And you mentioned Germany. There's political parties in Germany that have these sort of NED style foundations. And again, they work with the NED. They work in parallel with them in all of these countries, not just Myanmar. So this is something that the West, this is kind of the evolution of imperialism. They used to use missionaries. They kind of still do use missionaries, but it's kind of evolved into these foundations and these government aid organizations. They're doing it under the cover of aid, which is kind of like what missionaries claimed they were doing too when they served Western empires back in history. So that's what this all is. It's a combined effort. If you look through the funding and the political connections, it's all the same kind of handful of people. They're the same ones that, you know, say in the German government, if there's a pro-war political faction, they're also the ones funding this interference in other countries side by side with the NED. So it's these pro-war, pro-interventionist political parties that represent the largest corporate financier special interest in the West.
Yes, there's also the propaganda arm. I don't know how familiar you are with the USAGM. I mean, under USAGM, there are lots of entities like Radio Free Asia. It's the whole propaganda arm. And originally, the budget was around $800 million a year. And recently, there was a bill by Biden, you know, he issued a bill of $200 million. And the main focus was to demonize the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's the same as NED. You can go to NED, you can ask, oh, you know, I'm a reporter, and I'm actually very anti-Chinese or anti, you know, military in Myanmar. Can you give us some money? And they give you money. And the budget is enormous. We're talking about $1 billion per year. So can you give us some input, maybe from your experience both in Myanmar and in Thailand?
So that would be covering Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, and it's basically the U.S. government's propaganda arm, and they even admit that it's American state media. They're funding not just the propaganda outlets themselves, but they have all of these training initiatives. They are giving money to these organizations. They work together with these organizations. If you look at any of these NED-funded media organizations, they're constantly reprinting or co-announcing initiatives by, you know, Radio Free Asia, Voice of America. They republish their articles. The Democratic Voice of Burma. This is funded by the NED and Open Society. And Radio Free Asia used to broadcast through their channels. So it's just one gigantic propaganda network that they've created. And you just mentioned about Biden passing this bill. And what they're trying to do is communicate to the region how bad China is. The region who is already working with China has decided to work with China voluntarily. China doesn't have their troops occupying anyone. They're not into regime change. These governments are doing business with China. So this actually goes before Biden. Biden just put it into a bill. But if we remember the Indo-Pacific framework that was published in the White House archives during the Trump administration, that's what they were calling for, this campaign, this region-wide and actually global campaign to demonize China, to communicate the risks that China poses to their rules-based international order. So yeah, they wanted to pump millions and millions and millions of dollars into basically just anti-Chinese propaganda. We could see that manifesting everywhere we go, but they're ramping it up because this has been going on for many years. 10 years ago, when I was talking about the Misan Dam in Myanmar, this was a Chinese led project to build this dam in Myanmar. The US embassy itself, in their diplomatic cables leaked by WikiLeaks, admit that they were handing money out to these protest groups to protest the dam. So that's what they were doing. And I've seen articles from the same US funded network claiming, oh, Chinese media is accusing the US of funding activists to oppose Chinese-led development projects or the One Belt, One Road initiative. That's true. That's exactly what the US is doing. That is 100% fact.
Yeah, it seems they use more and more those activists, environmental activists. This is the new thing for against the Belt and Road Initiative. So they come up, it's very easy actually. You can find whatever species and endangers and write a story about this and try to, while the people, what they're looking for in Myanmar, which is a very poor country, they're starving. They're looking for, some prosperity. And so we're coming to those countries, developing countries, with those standards of environmental standards, while their requirements are different. They want to have food on the table. I'd like to go back to Aung San Suu Kyi. There's a lot of people do not understand, her position, especially when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative. They say, oh, she signed some bills, lots of memorandum of understanding, and she's been going to Beijing, and she seems to be very close to Beijing. And so is she a willing pawn of the US? Is she a hostage? Or is she playing both sides? Can you give us more information? Because a lot of people are confused.
I think people should just focus on actual evidence and actual things Aung San Suu Kyi and her government were doing before they were ousted, and focus less on her meeting with the president of China, because US presidents meet with the president of China. That doesn't mean that they're allies or that they're friends or that they're cooperating, and they might do these trade deals or whatever. But we know what the US agenda is, whatever diplomatic overtures they might make to make it look like they're trying to be reasonable. So for Aung San Suu Kyi, if you go all the way back to her early life, she was educated in the UK. She had a British husband. She has 2 children who are British citizens. When she speaks English, she speaks with this almost perfect British accent. She goes back and forth to London, to Washington. She literally visited the head of the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington. She accepted one of their awards from him and former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. These are people who she was comfortable associating with. Her entire, as I've said, her whole political party, members of her party, and now this so-called national unity government, these are people drawn from these fake NGOs that were funded by the US government. I think there's about 30 people ministers, deputy ministers, and senior leaders of this national unity government. And just a half a day of research, 8 of them have very obvious and troubling ties with the US government. So when you think about that, what is the chance of a government like this so heavily dependent on the US? And Aung San Suu Kyi herself, who has at least 2 Western advisors as part of her government, what is the chance of her actually going to pivot the country toward China and away from the West? I think the chance is less than, it's absolutely 0. She wasn't ever going to do it. I think she was facing the reality that Myanmar's economy depends almost entirely on China, Thailand, and Singapore. Sean Turnell is there to open the country up to Western interests, but that hasn't happened yet. So if she wants the economy to continue going, she needs to continue doing business with China. It's as simple as that. It was realism. It wasn't her wanting to be a partner with China. All signs point to her wanting to cut those ties as soon as possible. But this requires the liberalization, the liberalization of Myanmar's economy first, which she's having trouble doing because no one in the country is going to benefit from that. No one in the military is going to benefit from that. And the threat of them seizing power and ousting her because of her compromised ties with foreign interests was always there, always hanging over her head. So I think people need to think about all of that. Who's actually supporting her and backing her? The real source of her power is not in Myanmar. It's in Washington, it's in London, it's in Brussels. So people need to keep that in mind.
I'd like to go back to Sean Turnell, his arrest. So there was an arrest of 11 people from the open society. They blocked their accounts too in Myanmar. And also just go back to what they call the coup, but in reality, it's a constitutional takeover. Basically, the military are taking over for 1 year, and they're supposed to have new elections. But in reality, what the military is doing is just taking over sovereignty, and is trying, probably is going to do some cleaning in the house because it's completely hijacked. So what do you see the position now of the military? I mean, what are going to be the next steps?
The depths that the US and British have infected Myanmar's political landscape is so wide and so deep that I really don't know if they can do that in a year. They're going to have to do some drastic, take some very drastic measures to do this. But you're absolutely right. This wasn't them overthrowing a democratically elected government. This was them uprooting a client regime run out of foreign capitals. No country in the world would accept this being done to them. If we look at Aung San Suu Kyi and we try to flip the script a little bit and imagine if this was happening in the US, imagine a US president who had a Russian wife, 2 Russian children, was educated in Russia, came back to the US, ran for president, got into power, and filled his cabinet up with secretaries who all came from Russian-funded political organizations operating in the US with the expressed purpose of imposing the Russian political system onto the American people. How would that play out in the US? Would that be acceptable? Would that even be allowed to happen? The answer is absolutely not. There would be no way it would even be allowed to happen in the first place. Myanmar is not in the position that the US is to push back, but we can see that was the problem in Myanmar. You had basically foreigners running the country. You had white guys running around the country next to Aung San Suu Kyi, telling her what her policies were going to be. And people in her government who came from these US-funded organizations trying to shape and interfere Myanmar's political landscape. It's unacceptable. No country would accept that. The US wouldn't accept anyone doing that to them. And yet that's what they're doing to Myanmar. And then they're trying to portray the military in Myanmar as being unreasonable for not accepting this. But again, let's think back to the Western media's coverage. They're not pointing all of this out. When you talk about these advisors, and I'm going to go into this in future videos that I'm going to make, because I found this Joseph Fisher, you'll see the media actually talk about them, but they try to brush it off as if it's not a big deal that Aung San Suu Kyi has foreigners in her government advising her.
Yeah.
It's unreal.
Can you give a little bit the context? I mean, Myanmar is still there's still civil war. Again, I think there's no country in the world that would actually have democratic elections during civil war. You know, we remember during the Second World War, all the democracy was stopped in Europe and everywhere else in the world. I mean, we need to remember Myanmar is extremely complex. It's how many, I mean, hundreds of nationalities and it's still at war. So can you give us a little bit the background of those armed ethnic groups and also maybe some more information about the Rohingya issue, but also is there any collusion between those armed ethnic groups and Western powers?
Absolutely. This all goes back to British colonization. They went into Myanmar. Actually, they go into every country. This is what they do. They find these ethnic minorities, and then they give them this disproportionate role in administering everybody else, the ethnic majority. And this creates resentment, division, animosity, and eventually violence. And what you have is a whole region that the British control fighting and killing each other instead of uniting and expelling the British. This is what allowed this tiny little island nation to control vast swaths of the planet, because these people could not see past this divide and conquer, this very basic imperial tactic, and it allowed the British to just completely control them. And when they gained independence, when Myanmar gained independence from the British Empire, the British and then the US didn't say, okay, we respect your independence and we're going to leave you alone. No, they continued to pour millions of dollars every year into these ethnic groups that they used at the time as part of their colonial army, administering different parts of the, managing the country. They continued pouring money into these groups, and they do so to present day. So you have Karen, Kachin, in Arakan, you have the situation with the Rohingya and Rakhine State. You have all of these ethnic groups that the US openly is supporting them. And in some cases, they're arming them. They have Americans running around in the jungle with guns side by side with them. And again, this goes back to colonial times, World War II, and then post-World War II, where the US and the British were determined to prevent Myanmar from unifying its country and moving on. As actually, if you look at Southeast Asia, where the British ruled, you will see the same kind of pattern where they bring in people from India, Bangladesh. They had the ethnic tribes, and they mixed everything up, and they deliberately set it up so everyone hated each other. Malaysia had the same problem. They don't have quite the same problem with ethnic violence in Malaysia, but they do have problems. The only place that really solved it was Singapore, and that's because, and before they solved it, they had vicious race riots in the streets. And if you've been to Singapore, I think you have, right, Angelo? You've been to Singapore.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's like quite a nice place. You couldn't imagine race riots in the streets of Singapore, but that's because they wanted to stamp out this legacy of British colonialism. They passed laws that made it illegal to say disparaging things about other races and religions, and they really wanted to unify the country and move on. Myanmar has not been able to do this. It's a much bigger country, and the US and the British have been pouring millions and millions of dollars to keep those divides active. And so this is another reason why Myanmar has such a hard time. Why there's all of this political chaos, because this is the game that they're playing. The West is playing in Myanmar, this divide and conquer, even to present day.
Yes, I'd like us to take a higher vision. I mean, basically, we see this as a proxy war, US-China proxy war, and there's a Belt and Road Initiative. There's also a strategy. There was a pivot to Asia policy from Obama, which is about encircling. How are we going to encircle China? There's many different ways. Either you create chaos, or you put some bases, army bases, and also, well, Myanmar is very critical for China. There's it's an access, there's a pipeline, right? That goes through from Kunming to all the way to the sea. And the Belt and Road Initiative, can you give us, I mean, more information about this, and also what were the attempts of destroying or delaying those Belt and Road Initiatives? There's three projects: the deep sea port mine, the deep sea port, the mining, and also another one which is the dam, the big dam.
Yes.
Yes.
China's actually completed several projects. They already have the pipeline. They have dams that they've built. They've built bridges, and you can see the tangible improvement to the lives of the people in Myanmar because of this real development. And the U.S. cannot compete. When you look at U.S. aid, what kind of programs are they funding? So we see, like, even more recently, $72 million to strengthen civil society, the media, and local communities. How does that help someone in one community cross a river to get to the other community to do business? It doesn't. All this is about is creating division and chaos. This is the largest hurdle China has to cross to build these infrastructure projects. So you're talking about some other dams that were proposed. The U.S. had these ethnic groups go out and protest them, and they had these armed militant groups attack construction sites to prevent these projects from being completed. Infrastructure helps unify a country, a railroad, roads, bridges. This helps unite people, helps unite a country. If Myanmar was more united, this game of divide and conquer will become more and more difficult for the Americans and the British. So this is why they invest so much in fueling this animosity. And it's not just Myanmar. We've seen this in Pakistan. Pakistan has a very good relationship with China, and China is building a lot of infrastructure projects there. And they have the Gwadar port in southwest Baluchistan. And the US is funding and backing and arming militants there. There's some ethnic minority there, and they're funding and arming them to disrupt those projects. So they did it there in Pakistan. They're doing it in Myanmar. We saw what they tried to do in Xinjiang, inside China's own borders, to block development. So there's a pattern there. It's very easy to see. And it's because the US cannot compete. They cannot build infrastructure like that. All they can do is come in with their, civil society and media and meddling in the dynamics in local communities. This is all they know how to do. This is their one trick. And we see them doing it in every single country, including Myanmar. So that's what people need to think about. What these opposition groups, how do they feel about China and development China is doing inside Myanmar? And then people have to ask themselves, what does Myanmar gain? What do the people there gain by blocking a dam, or blocking a bridge, or stopping a road from being constructed, or blocking a port from being constructed? These are things that every nation needs to thrive economically, and without these things, they will remain impoverished. So it's very obvious that these people are not coming up to this, they're not coming to this conclusion on their own. It's all of this US aid, NED, open society money flowing in. People have built entire careers taking this dirty money from abroad and using it to impede progress in their own country. They themselves have very comfortable lives because they're getting all this money from abroad, but they're blocking progress in their own country, and they're denying that sort of personal development and progress to millions of people.
So it seems that the US has failed into putting a puppet regime in Myanmar. So where are we going from there? I mean, what is we've seen in other cases where they failed, and the other options was to create a civil war and just chaos. I mean, we saw what happened in Syria. Now we start seeing same patterns as we saw in government in issues like in Venezuela. So you have government in exile, and then there's a freezing of funding, and then so what is next for Myanmar? Is the civil war? I mean, just because they didn't win, the US didn't win, you might as well just create chaos, right?
That's what it looks like they're trying to do. They have this parallel government that they created, the National Unity Government. It's populated with all of these US government funded proxies, basically, including Aung San Suu Kyi herself. They openly admit they're going to create an armed, they call it a defense force, but what they're going to do with it is attack the central government. They say they're going to take over in violent, revolution. This is what they themselves have said. This is their plan. And of course, it's not their plan. It's the plan of the US, the British, and all the other countries going along with this. It's their plan. And it's exactly as you said. They cannot get a client regime into power. They will destroy the country. And let's be honest, even when they do get a client regime of their choosing into power, they're not actually going to allow that country to prosper. Look at Ukraine. How are they doing since they got their so-called democracy? How well is that going for Ukraine? And we could imagine the best case scenario for Myanmar would be Aung San Suu Kyi somehow, her and her client regime, US client regime, getting back into power, and Myanmar ending up like Ukraine. That's the best case scenario. Worst case scenario is, just as you said, this US fueled proxy war. It wouldn't be a civil war because it's not really the people of Myanmar fighting with each other. It's this foreign influence reaching in and driving the conflict. That's not really civil war. It's a proxy war, just as you said.
Yes, and because there are so many nationalities, there's also a great risk of balkanization. Maybe a scenario that we saw also in the USSR. So basically, Myanmar just being completely separated in 4 or 5 different nations. I think so. It's not looking very good, and it seems like. Can you give us so we have the case of Myanmar, but overall we can see an encirclement of China. Can you give us more examples of maybe Thailand? You are very familiar with Thailand. Can you give us more information which are a bit similar to what is happening in Myanmar?
As I've said, the US has just basically one playbook that they use when they go into each country. And in regards to Southeast Asia, we could even see the US-backed protests here in Thailand and the US-backed protests in Myanmar. They're using the exact same symbols. They even openly coordinate with one another. They're flying American flags. They're flying the East Turkestan separatist flag, the Tibetan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong protester flags. You could see it's a very obvious region-wide project the US is working on to stir up trouble, to try to turn the region against China. Just like you said, they have this propaganda war that they're openly waging against China, that the US government is openly funding, but they're also reaching into each one of these countries and trying to poison their institutions or create parallel institutions to overwrite existing ones. And these are pro-US, anti-Chinese, and they're going to do the same thing here in Southeast Asia that they did in Eastern Europe. They're going to arrest development, not spur it, to have this dysfunctional, balkanized region if they succeed. Now, luckily, the US-backed protests here in Thailand seem to have kind of burned out for the time being. The protests in Hong Kong look like they're permanently over. There's still places like Malaysia where US influence is strong, and there's still a threat there. And of course, Myanmar. Then you've got countries like Cambodia that have very directly confronted the US, uprooted, NED-funded organizations, Voice of America, all of them just pushed out of the country or put in jail. The Cambodian opposition party actually literally is run out of Washington, D.C. The leaders are based in Washington, D.C. So that's where you want to see all of this going. So it's a pivotal time right now where we're waiting to see what happens, and we just hope that the region kind of sticks together, tries to wait out what happens in Myanmar. Hopefully this can get, you know, it's hard to say because they have been fighting amongst themselves with these ethnic groups since they got independent. So it's hard to, like, what is normal for Myanmar to where they just go back to low intensity infighting? I don't know. But one thing we do know is as China continues to rise, as the US continues to wane from the region, as these infrastructure projects go through, everybody's going to be lifted up by them. That's what building infrastructure does. That's why the West had been so prosperous for so long. They had fully developed infrastructure. So we can only hope that as this infrastructure is built, as economic cooperation grows, the people's willingness to go along with these artificial uprisings backed by the US, the willingness to go along with them is less and less, and something resembling regional stability emerges. We actually, you know, if you look at the Middle East, you could already see the US's ability to destroy that region is already being diminished, and that's a very turbulent region. So we could hope that it never gets that bad in Southeast Asia, and that things can improve much quicker than they seem to be in the Middle East.
Well, Brian, thank you very much. I think it's very important that we continue to give the information about what is happening there. You know, it's a replica. We've seen it over and over. I think they target young people that don't have the knowledge. You know, it's because they need to understand that it's about, you know, they need to learn about history. They need to learn about what it means to have a real democracy. And I think they are easily manipulated by Hollywood, by, you know, by emotional triggers, rational rather than just rational thinking. And I think it's very sad. And the outcome is just destruction. It's very sad. So I think it's very important. I think what you're doing is just an amazing job. Maybe if you want to, could you give us more information about what are your activities, your websites, how we can support your work?
I have my YouTube channel, Land Destroyer. Just type in Land Destroyer, should be the first one that pops up. I have a blog, landdestroyer.blogspot.com. So a lot of my articles and videos end up on there as well. And if you go to the video description of any of my videos, there's going to be a lot of links to alternate video sites and websites that you can find my work. And thank you, Angelo, for doing this. And also thank you for all of the research that you helped me with, because this is something that no one can do on their own. I mean, when you see the scale of what the US is doing, think about the scale of the task ahead of people that want to oppose that. And so we all have to continue working together. I really also appreciate what you're doing, Angelo.
Thank you, Brian. Well, keep it up with the great job. Huh? Nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Yes.